It's lovely to have this opportunity to connect and to explore the various questions that I know that you've been exploring, and particularly starting with the question of plant intelligence,
Mm,
plant agency, plant sentience.
mm,
And we know that in Buddhism, it's a major warrant for compassion to know that a being is sentient.
yes.
Suffering is often defined or understood in reference to our experience of suffering. And the ability to include plants within our circle of compassion requires us to think about sentience, but also and just a general ethics for living as related beings brings us right into this question. And since you've thought and written about this a great deal, I wonder if you could just kind of share with us your thinking on this.
I would love to. So, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. I know that some of the audience will include people from Latin America. I'd like to reach out in solidarity with you. I apologize for my country. We're doing everything we can, but it is the mess that it is. So, thank you for your indulgence. And I think it's a fantastic question. I would like to offer the following. I'll start very big and then I'll work my way up to it, I hope, in small little steps. I think the universe is sentient. I think if the universe is sentient, everything is sentient. That was Dogen's position in the 13th century. Sentience is a very good teaching tool in the beginning, but as you go more deeply along the path, it remains valuable, but it's not a distinction. There may not, in the final analysis, be a distinction between sentience and non-sentience. Now, that's an enormous idea. It has warrant from some parts of the Mahayana traditions. Others would find it crazy. I realize that. It also, I think, helps us use some other friends, including science, including all the remarkable research that's coming out to help us appreciate the path that we're on. So, what might it mean to think of the universe as sentient? If by the universe being sentient, everything's sentient, let's talk about plant sentience and plant intelligence. What would it mean to say a plant is intelligent? The typical way of answering that question, and here's the big Buddhist intervention because the typical way is not the healthy way, would be to use our own intelligence as a point of reference. Is a plant like me? Well, the striking thing about a plant is, in many ways, it's more unlike you than it is like you. When we think of our sentience, we imagine our mind, we imagine all the anxieties we have and hopes and dreams, our plans and frustrations. And we start saying, well, does a plant do math? Does a plant have fear? Or we start thinking, well, maybe by analogy to us, a plant could have fear. And there's some science that shows that there are, in a very, very rough way, kind of defensive responses in plants. But this entire question is being inaugurated by what we assume to be the place from which we start to ask it. What are the assumptions behind the question? The big assumption behind the question is, are we the model? Are we the measure of sentience? By saying the universe is sentient, are we saying the universe is like us, or that we are like the universe? Now, I wanted to start rehearsing some of the classic objections with starting that from that perspective. One, it is rather egotistical. It is a rather self-obsessed. It is, just to state the most obvious, one of the great obstacles to any successful practice is ourselves. So it'd be interesting that we would say that in our practice, but still use ourselves as the measure of all things. I want to say, first of all, this is a stunningly arrogant thing to do. We are the measure of the universe. We, a tiny little speck on an enormous planet, it's a tiny little speck in our galaxy, a galaxy which is a tiny little speck in the universe. This speck among specks among specks among specks is the measure of all things. And if it's not like us, it doesn't make the sentience cut. That's what we're saying, honestly. And I would say as a practitioner, once you realize that, that should give you pause. But I want to suss out what some of the other implications of this starting point are. If we are the measure of intelligence, if we are the measure of sentience, if things are valuable because they are sentient and less valuable because they're not sentient, that's what we're saying. Because sentience is not just a descriptor, it's an evaluative phrase. The sentient world is superior to the non-sentient world. We maybe can't do things to sentient things that we can do to rocks or to mountains or to soil, because none of that's sentient. There's a brand new book that just came out by Robert McFarlane, Is a River Alive? The river does not have sentience if by sentience we mean we're the measure of it. It would be an absurd thing to say. And we'd also have to confront the following. Why do so many indigenous peoples, so our spiritual ancestors found all over the world, why do they regard the universe, the earth, all these things as, well, animist, sentient, alive, as precious? I think of my own part of the world, the famous letter from Chief Seattle. Everything is alive, everything is sacred. And he gives two examples, a rock and the earth, soil. We say, well, wait a minute, a rock or a soil, they're so unlike me. Or I think of my own tradition, the Soto Zen tradition of Zen Master Dōgen, uh, his very famous fascicle, the Mountains and Waters Sutra. So mountains and waters, also figures of form and emptiness, themselves are the sutra, not a sutra about them. They are the sutra. How are mountains a sutra? Well, they're constantly walking, says the ancient Chinese tradition that he's citing. What does it mean that they're constantly walking? They don't walk like us. They don't go very far. But we're not the measure of geological time. Human time is a speck in time. We are not the measure of walking. We are not the measure of sentience. But if we are, value has only two places that it can appear. We might want to say, the most obvious, because we're the measure of all things, things are valuable insofar as they're valuable to us. Because they're like us or they're in our interests. We might say this is instrumental value. Instrumental value would just be a fancy pants word to say the following. Good for something we want to do. Good for something we want to achieve. Something that fits well with our scheming and our plans. So something we can exploit. We generally think in this economic stage of our existence that the entire universe is unsentient and instrumental, and we can extract and exploit and put to work and refashion the entire thing so that it is as much like us as possible. Not a Buddhist value, by the way. We
As
should
much
really
like
give
us
us
and as much
pause.
suited to our needs.
Yes. You know, do we cover the earth with leather or do we become our own good pair of shoes?
Mhm.
You know, the Mahayana, that's the latter. It goes for the latter. Become shoes, be able to walk on things as they are, not refashion them to
Mhm.
fit our instrumental demands. But then our own tradition also has a pause to our mania for instrumentality. And that might mean, well, not everything can be instrumental. We can't use everybody. For example, we at least believe in principle. We don't act on it very robustly as a species, but we at least believe in principle that, well, other human beings are sacred. They have an inviolable dignity. They're valuable in themselves. So if you make it to the class of human beings, that somehow means that there are limits, or maybe even for some people, a wall, an absolute border against using or exploiting someone. We're not supposed to exploit each other uh, in many, many ways, even though our entire economic system is based on the exploitation of labor. But then when we go to church on Sundays or temple or wherever else we go, we say, well, we're all sacred, all children of God, all these kinds of lines. We're intrinsically valuable, valuable in themselves, not valuable for something beyond themselves, but valuable by just being what they are. Human dignity. So what you get simply by being human is inviolable, as we know from a 1945 very famous intervention on human rights. Um, but we start saying, well, what things get to be called valuable in themselves? What things are intrinsically valuable? All living things? Well, no, we eat living things all the time. For example, even if you're a vegan, plants. How about this? Viruses. Viruses are alive. Do we think, wow, let all the flowers bloom? COVID sounds great. My cancer cells, your cells are alive. When they go cancerous, let all the flowers. No one believes that. So there's always a limit. So to the extent to which something is like us, it's valuable. But to the extent to which it contests us, we immediately say it immediately becomes instrumental again. So it ends up being a very small class of objects that are sacred, and they're all seen from the point of view of us as the measure. Now, if in our practice we come to confront our ego, as it begins in Zen, we say, in our practice of meditation, it sloughs off. The body and mind slough off. They fall away. The illusion of that starting point drops off, just like you're falling asleep. Although in this case, you're falling awake, and it just drops off. And you're not so somnolent, not so asleep in your point of view. And you suddenly realize, the one that would be the ruler of the universe, the one that would be the center of all things, that is also at the cause, that is the complicity that I share with my own suffering. It's catastrophic for everything, including me. So now let's look at a plant. How is a plant intelligent? Well, we'd have to begin with plants, not human beings as the measure of intelligence, but plants. Well, if we look at ourselves and we say, well, what makes us intelligent is it's a feature found in us. Each person has this thing called intelligence, and for every person, maybe it's not so distributed to the President of the United States, it's better distributed to others, but everyone's got some measure of this thing called intelligence. It's an individual quality. You look in the plant and you go, well, where is its individual quality like this? Well, that's already a very egotistical point of view. It's also a crazy view of intelligence. Your intelligence is because you speak a language you did not invent. It's because you have teachers who are not you. It's because you have air and food and water that make your body work. Intelligence, if it is just you, it goes the same way of all things that are just you. It's isolated and it becomes like a fish out of the water. It flounders and is gone. Clearly, it's bigger than us. Now, you'll see this very deeply in your own Buddhist practice. But the mind is not to be reduced to your individual mind. It's an illusion. It's an illusion of the ego that wants credit for everything. But how is a plant expressing intelligence? Intelligence is found in how plant communities, as communities, solve their problems, how they participate with mycelial connections underneath the soil. The plants and the mycelial order, we used to say they're in different kingdoms. That's crazy. Wow, that crazy politics. But I think now it's more proper to say, as some people do, they're in different kingdoms. They have different relations. But different kingdoms relate in order to plants need mycelial networks. Mycelial networks need plants and trees. And you find the intelligence in the system itself as it finds ways to adapt, as it finds ways to shed disease and intrusions, as it connects with each other. Wohlleben has said the following about trees. It's just a metaphor, because metaphors are using ourselves as the analogy, but then you have to drop it. But a tree all by itself is like a human being in solitary confinement, because you're cutting them off from their intelligence. Their intelligence is found in the systems themselves, which are evolving, responsive, problem solving. Now, when we begin to say, wow, the problem of the Anthropocene So we're the measure of everything. And having been the measure of everything, life as we know it is about not to be anything we want or anything else wants. That's the big picture implication of our starting point ecologically. We'll make everything like us and destroy everything in the process. Um, but in the Anthropocene, it's keeping us from learning to think not like human beings, but like a planet. And not a planet is a very general way of saying to think like a planet, you have to begin to think in ecosystems. And in these ecosystems, we suddenly see that not only is the ego pernicious to my individual life, I see this already in the sitting pillow, I see this already as I go more deeply along my path, but it's also insidious in our greater mind ecology. We're a species in runaway that threatens the intelligence of the ecology. And suddenly you say, wow, there's something crazy about human intelligence. It's capable of the following crazy activity. It can destroy the intelligence of the systems that make it possible, and in so doing, declare it's the only intelligent thing. That does not drive you to your pillow and to your practice. I don't know what will. So that's kind of the direction I would be coming from on that.
Before we go on, I wonder if you could reflect on how does changing our experience of plants, personhood, or intelligence change or impact our spiritual practice?
Yeah, I mean, personhood is like intelligence. You're repurposing the term. The history of personhood, and again, I don't want to dismiss the tradition. It has its values, but it's solving a very different problem. When you assign personhood to something, you're setting it aside as an object that has intrinsic value or special value. You're lifting it out as belonging to the class of valuable things. But from the perspective of mind more broadly and of these systems more broadly, everything matters. Now, not everything matters to me personally. Many things matter, but they don't matter to human beings even remotely. Uh, it doesn't mean that you're saying, oh my God, it's all sacred. I can't do anything about it. That's always the trap of that. Give everything personhood. Well, then what? The river has personhood. What happens when it's flooding? I can't stop it. I can't build a wall to protect the monastery. You get in these crazy things. You know, the rather than personhood, we have to think that value is found in the health of the relationality of the system, how things work and cooperate together, how they mutually enhance each other. To become a participant in a sangha in which the members of the sangha are, of course, all human beings, but everything. To have a practice in which, um, rather than personhood, it's the web. Of course, in the Mahayana tradition from YN, there's a very famous tradition that the Japanese call Keigon, the Flower Garland Sutra, this very famous work. Um, in this tradition, they speak of Indra's net, and it's a very interesting image. So each little node on the net is unique. It's singular. Each little node in its singular way reflects the whole net. But each little node is only itself because of the net itself. It loses itself when it loses the net. You have to be able to think your singularity not as isolated from the net, but as part of the great Sangha net of the universe itself, the universe's great intelligence. You're sharing in the universe's intelligence when you do a Buddhist practice. You're not standing above it or in isolation to it or one-upping it. You're stepping down from your crazy dukkha position in order to participate in the universal intelligence of the way of things and the way of the universe. In the Japanese tradition, we speak not of Buddhism, but of Butsudo, Do Dao, the way of the Buddha. But the way of the Buddha is the way of things. I mean, in a very explicit reference to the Chinese roots of Zen and the Tao. Um, so that's what I would say.
So you mentioned Dogen, and within our community at different moments in different places in our training, Dogen is an inspiration and a resource for thinking and feeling, particularly about Buddha nature. And I
Yes.
wonder if you could give us a brief introduction to people who've maybe heard of Dogen or maybe haven't heard of this
Yes.
important thinker, and particularly walk us, if you could, through Dogen's idea of Great Earth,
Oh, absolutely.
and also of how understanding Buddha nature from his angle of vision could enrich our thinking about plant mattering, plant intelligence, plant communal sentience.
Yeah. Things that Dogen's all about. So we can just begin with Dogen. So Dogen's his Dharma name. What does the name Dogen mean in Japanese? Do, Tao, again, gateway, the gateway to the Tao, the gateway to the way of things, not the gateway to him or to Soto. We speak of Soto Zen as Dogen Zen sometimes. The two aren't exactly the same, but they're obviously related. Soto imagines that it comes from Dogen, but Dogen himself is very clear on this issue. Whoever says Zen school is a devil. And he then says, well, what do I mean by devil? He defines devil. Those who are enemies of Dharma, Buddha, and Sangha. So thinking of schools and saying like Dogen's trying to pull you into his club away from another club is not the way of things. Is there's one universe or pluriverse or however you want to think it. And we need to endeavor to practice it together because I am this, you are this. So Dogen lived in the 13th century in Japan. He went to China to train with his teacher. The Japanese read the characters as Nyojo. Rujing is the Chinese pronunciation. And his great awakening in China is when he suddenly realized or suddenly experienced what his teacher had experienced. Shinjin Datsuraku, the sloughing off or falling away of body and mind. So this position that I was describing, it sloughs off or falls away. Dogen then returned to Japan, was very disappointed with the Zen. Zen's hard. Buddhism's hard. The Buddha way is hard. Not everyone who practices is any good. All teachers are worth learning from. It's the hard thing. I think most traditions say that one of your lifelong tasks in your practice is to find your teachers, not the first one, the good ones. They should be plural. They should include humans. They shouldn't just be humans. Um, this world, that was Dogen. He was very disappointed. He eventually founded his own monastery through a small little gift from somebody and some land. They built it themselves in a very remote part of Japan, countryside. So Soto is still kind of countryside Zen versus Kyoto Zen. Eiheiji, the temple of eternal peace. To be at peace with things, not the ego warring with things as it tries to cover the world with leather, but to let things be what they are. As you live, live. As you die, die. Be present. Show up. Not ego shows up. Let things show themselves of themselves. And Dogen said this was also one of the ways to understand dana. Dana is not just giving. It's being at peace with the way of things. So he gives two examples of dana. Letting the flowers grow, not cutting the trees, and not taking everything. Not taking, you're not the measure of things. Letting things be what they are, not measuring things according to yourself. And Dogen's image of that, in a very famous early fascicle called the Genjo Koan, is to find ourselves on a ship. And we think, wow, look at the shore move. And the illusion of being on a ship and seeing the shore move, we've all had this experience if you've been on a ship by the shore, is that you don't see your own moving. You don't see that what your position, your subject position, your viewing position, how you see the world and what's hidden in how you see the world makes the world appear a certain way. And so his masterpiece is called the Shobo Genzo. Shobo Genzo, the treasury of the true Dharma eye. It's a reference to a very famous teaching story. I think everyone probably knows it. The story of the Buddha and Mahakashapa, when the Buddha holds up the flower and winks at Mahakashapa, and Mahakashapa says nothing, he just smiles. And this very famous initial transmission of the Dharma, beyond words and letters, not against words and letters, but not just talk, not just a belief, but suddenly seeing your own mind and breaking out in joy. Um, this he called the treasury of the true Dharma eye. So getting your Dharma eye to open, to be able to see not with the view from the ship, but to release yourself to your mind and to see with your heart mind, to see with your full being, to see not that I'm a person in the universe. I'm an expression of the way of things, and I'm related and not separate to all things. And I want to get better at that. I can't help myself by isolating myself. I can only help myself by helping more broadly all my kin, all my relations, all my sangha. And that's very much the spirit of Dōgen. Non-separation, non-ego, opening the Dharma eye, seeing that if you're a Buddha, it's because all things are Buddha. Buddha is to see things with your Dharma eye and not to have some belief about things or to belong to some school or be talked into some bill of goods by some teacher, myself or anyone else included, on your own pillow or however you practice. Suddenly, the ego sloughs off and falls away. And suddenly, the pine is beautiful. But you also realize, like on Indra's net, if you want to understand the pine, as Basho said, study the pine. But it's not in isolation. You study the node of the pine on the great kinship sangha of all things. You study its node of intelligence in the universe's great intelligence. Otherwise, you're just saying crazy things like intelligence is something that, for whatever reason, we have, no one else has it, we're the best, and we separate ourselves not even as a species from all things, although we do that, but within our own egomaniacal devotion to our species, what Peter Singer once called speciesism. You know, the view of my species is always right simply because I'm a member of that species. It's a crazy position logically and philosophically. But then even within our species, we have a war of who counts and who doesn't count. And the opening of the true Dharma eye. This is the fruit of practice. So not some moment in which you have some special realization of some particular theory about the universe. Your mind is fresh and clear. Your heart is wide and open. That's the spirit of Dogen. Dogen's also hard, you know, for somebody who said, don't be attached to the briars and brambles of words. You know, the Shobogenzo is somewhere in the order of 900 pages. It's notoriously difficult. Not difficult because of academic tricks or jargon. Difficult because Dogen's so precise that you don't see how crystal clear he is until you use him as an accompaniment to practice. And as your practice deepens, it becomes clear that Dogen becomes more accessible. And in Eiheiji, Dogen had the Zendo and the library right next to each other. They're separate things. You know, if you can only go to one room, go to the Zendo. Practice. If you are practicing, don't shut off your mind. If you don't practice, then you have all kinds of word attachments and belief attachments, and it's always been done this way, so lazy excuses. None of those things cut the mustard for any serious practitioner. You're on the pillow. Everything has to earn its right. The taste is in the pudding of your own practice. But go back to the tradition as your mind is opening and your heart is opening. You'll read it more critically, but also its profundity will be more present. That's Dogen in a nutshell. Read more Dogen is always my advice.
Could you bring us into the territory that he's exploring when he's using this idea of Great Earth?
Yes, yes. So that's a phrase that appears often in the Shobogenzo, mostly in the first half. And it's always in the phrase something of this, like this: mountains, waters, the great earth. This is a classic Dōgen rhetorical strategy. You use, so it's a non-dual move. So you use the terms of the duality, and then you name what holds them together in their non-duality. So the great earth is the holding together of mountains and waters. And we can start with, say, in the Japanese, the word for landscape, sansui, pronouncing the Chinese word for landscape, sanshui, same word, same characters. It's the character for mountain and water. And if you think of the landscape tradition in China and what's called Nanga in Japan, the southern style, you see lots of mountains and waters. And if you look at how they're constructed, you don't paint water. Water is always evoked with negative space. And that negative space is the same space, emptiness, if you will, that's also giving the contours of the mountain their visibility, allows them to pop out. In Japanese and Chinese, the word for emptiness, shunyata, this very famous term for practitioners, is the same word as sky. You don't see the sky. The sky is what allows you to see what you do see when you look up. The stars, the birds, the clouds. The form comes out against emptiness. So the mountains stand out against emptiness, but not just passively. The emptiness is constantly working on the mountains, keeping the mountains from being stuck as mountains. If you look at our watersheds, the ancient mountains are always the smallest because they've been worked all the way down. If you look at, say, the island of Hawaii, the younger it gets, the higher the mountains. The highest mountain in the world, measured from its base in the ocean, is Mauna Kea on the Big Island. But the farther north you go, north of Kauai, you keep going. It's the ancient chain of Hawaii. Far enough north, they're flat. They're gone. Over the millions of years, this form in its dance with emptiness is no longer even a mountain. So mountains and waters gives you this dynamic of the play of form and emptiness. It's very attractive because that's also how we think of ecologies. Ecologies are really about watersheds. How movable and unmovable things are constantly working together. And this is the great earth, these forces. And so when he says the great earth, the thought in Zen is the great earth without one speck of soil left out. And that's his way of also saying the universe is intelligent. The universe is sentient. And by universe we mean everything, with nothing left out. All people, all animals and plants, all earthlings. But that's very tiny, the entire universe. It's all connected. It's all the net.
So I want to share my baby understanding of Dogen so that you can help it mature. I have this sense that with the Great Earth, he's drawing our attention or expressing that everything, including the last speck of dirt, is a manifestation of Buddha nature and
Absolutely.
is therefore not scenery, not landscape, but an active participant in the expression of Buddha nature, which is Dharma. And when we think about this, so that's the first part. And then I want to think about how that helps us move towards an ethics, because once we start recognizing the agency of mountains and rivers, we have a basis for environmental ethics.
Yeah. Um,
But
yeah.
first help my baby understanding grow up a little bit.
Yeah. So, yeah, the great earth is the great inclusive term. It marks for Dogen the intent of all things, the way of all things, the non-duality of all things. Um, in a way, mountains, so normally think of the word landscape. That's the word that's normally used to translate a word like sans sui or sans shui. But it's not a very good translation because it takes one tradition that looked at these things as remote or as interest, so instrumentally or maybe as sacred or beautiful or belonging to nice scenery versus ugly scenery, national parks versus sacrifice zone. This sort of thinking, this kind of stuff that human beings like, stuff that human beings don't like, that's not the thought at all. Now, Gary Snyder makes a very interesting suggestion that the Sang Shui tradition in China began precisely at a time in which deforestation was running rampant and these things were being lost. So it's not like, wow, there's something intrinsic to this part of the world. We had it all down, and then how you crazy people later, you just forgot what we always knew. China, for example, is a long story of ecological disaster, just like everywhere else. I don't want to pick on China, but it wasn't like there was all these Taoists and Buddhists running around and all the flowers were blooming and the mountains were beautiful. Um, it was a disaster. And so these paintings come because they're trying to get us to show us not something that we can look at or some set of objects as beautiful. It's not landscape that we look at and say, oh, isn't that pretty? In a way, it's a kind of a self-portrait that we're looking at ourselves more deeply by trying to evoke the systems within which we are. So if you look at a Chinese landscape painting, you have the mountains and waters in their interplay. By waters, we also mean skies, clouds, just even all the negative space. And then how, like in Zen, a single stroke gives you the play between the ink form and the emptiness of this paper on which you're writing. So they're doing that also. But then at the base of these paintings, you see human beings, but tiny. Maybe a little bridge across the water, a little hut underneath the mountains. And suddenly we're seeing ourselves in right relation. It's not for us, we're of it. It's much bigger than us. We're not the measure of it. We have to cooperate with it. We cannot dominate or to control it. We have to remember this is the great earth as it appears when we don't find ourselves opposed to it, the measure of it, and therefore open the door to be the dominator of it. And so I wouldn't even say ethics in a technical term. The only reason I wouldn't say that is ethics are like, what should I do? This or that. I would say to realize this, to suddenly realize who you are, to be yourself is to be the mountain and the water. To be yourself, to suddenly realize that it's not me and these things, and do I enter this relationship or that relationship with them, ethical or unethical? I am already these relations. I'm already standing out. I'm not coming to them with ethics. I'm already of them. As Huineng, the famous sixth patriarch of China, said, I am this, you are this. And so Buddhist ethics, I think, emerge deeply out of a realization of the way of things. That's what I would say. And that doesn't mean that ethical questions go away. There's lots of quandaries in life, but it's underwritten by a deep realization of our relationality.
Well, I understand ethics to be not deontological or consequential in nature, but I think more in terms of a reciprocal, something that can animate our way of living reciprocal relations, maybe more an ethics of care or reciprocal care would come to mind. But I do see a longing for some better sense of a multi-species, maybe post-human ethics of responsibility or ethics of relationship. And
Yes.
I wonder, I wonder if that's a longing that you felt or that you have an answer for.
I think that longing is part of our dukkha. I think we long for it and we feel very helpless for it and we grasp at it with some of these ethics. I mean, they're a step in the right direction, but they still strike me as too tepid. So when we think of Chief Seattle writing a letter to where I live in the 19th century and saying the earth does not belong to us and that everything is sacred, rocks and earth, we have no idea what he's talking about. It sounds like wacky, magical New Age thinking, or you know, what kind of mind would say these sorts of things? Where is this coming from? In the Mahayana, we if one of the famous teaching stories is to imagine your mind as a mirror. It's always very attractive to me because the mirror shows everything as what it is. It doesn't say, I only show the beautiful people, I exclude the ugly people. Whatever comes with the mirror gets to be what it is. The mirror doesn't pick favorites. But if the mirror is dusty, no matter what comes into the mirror, um, it sees in a dusty way. And you can't solve the problem of the dusty mirror by changing the objects that you bring to the mirror. If you bring non-ethics to the mirror, it sees dusty non-ethics. If you bring ethics to the mirror, it sees dusty ethics. So there's a kind of what we would say in my profession, a kind of a meta-ethical question. You have to step beyond ethics to try to get to the foundation. Where would these things come from? Because a lot of the ethical dispositions, I agree with their disposition to the world, ethics of care. Of course, I care about caring. I think well of all these things. But the practitioner in me wants to step outside those and say, what at the very deepest ground inspires that? Why would it be unethical to ask someone, should we be ethical? No, I mean, the only question is, given that we want to be ethical, how better to be ethical? Not should we or should we not be ethical? And where does this desire to be ethical come from? Ethics cannot make you want to be ethical. Ethics is what people who want to be ethical argue about. You know, you're not saying they're having an argument about between, say, virtue ethics and care ethics and consequentialism among people who don't give a damn about ethics. They're all people who deeply care and they're deeply invested. But we also know we live in a world in which it seems almost founded on a disregard for any possible ethics. The hardened heart, the closed mind, the greed and the grasping, the Buddha's three poisons. These are deeper issues, deeper than ethics. Not until the mirror is cleaned does the splendor of ethics open itself up. And so I would say it really begins in your practice and to trust your practice because as your mind becomes clearer, you argue about ethics less neurotically, less selfishly, less with less grasping, more generously. Your sense of the stakes of human life become larger, even as you become humbler. That's kind of what I would say. I mean, I would say it's the Buddhist ethics is rooted in what's being clarified in the mind and heart.
So I want to move out from the mind and heart and into related action and just put the examples of movements in many different places across Latin America to grant either personhood or rights to, for example, rivers
Yes.
as a means of actual protection.
Yes.
That is an ethical gesture. There have been successful initiatives in Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia. There have been regional and local initiatives or movements trying to seek something, sometimes failed. And their consequences for example, in Chile, a constitutional draft that didn't go through. Now rivers are private property.
Yes.
Whereas there in some municipalities in Peru and in Mexico, there are protections in place where people are encouraged by the application of ethics beyond the individual practice, but into a collective sphere, that people have this opportunity to understand themselves, to have ethical responsibilities in those relationships.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's such an important question. I would have two lines of thinking on it. One, I'll talk about rights in the broadest possible level, and then I'm going to defend them. The limitation of a discourse on rights, even from an indigenous perspective, where a lot of this comes from, is you're working on the symptom and not the root. So we may give people rights. For example, I don't have a right to kill you. I don't have a right to own this river. But it doesn't deal with the root problem, which is, why do I want to kill you? Why do I want to own this river? So those are the things we should be working on most deeply, because rights are just protecting us from each other and from our worst instincts. But we're not working on the real problem, which is that we need to protect the world from ourselves. I mean, we're the species that say we need to save the earth. And it's not obvious to us. What should be obvious if you thought for 5 seconds, save it from what? From ourselves. We're the threat. It's crazy. The real problem is, what's wrong with us that we have to save the earth and not see that what we're saving it from is from ourselves? Recycle. Well, no, stop making so many things that need to be recycled. Can we recycle plastic? Stop making plastic, for example, or stop making it so profligately. I would say, so that's the root problem. That being said, the realist in me, I think anybody who really loves the world isn't going to say, let's wait around till we're all Buddhas. There's going to be nothing left. So I'm 100%, and I can't admire more, especially what's happening in South America, but also I know New Zealand. New Zealand now has a sacred river. Quebec just won this battle. Quebec's got some of the largest number of dams in the world. It's crazy what they're doing up there. Everyone thinks Canada is the exception. It is not. It's just like everyone else. It's also a major extractor and petrol state. Um, so if rights is the best weapon we have right now, if it's the best thing that we can do, if I have to give a river a right in a world in which people own a river, in which that's even plausible, in which you're not laughed out of the room when you think you own this river, when we have to take that position seriously, yeah, we better give it rights. And it's tough. I look at the one of the most robust protections, so Ecuador protecting the wild systems of the entire country, Pachamama. Um, in their recent constitution, not even 20 years old, it's tough because the IMF and these international forces, which these incredible debt loads impoverish a country. They keep the country from being able to build hospitals and good schools as they service these debts largely to the country in which I live in, but not just to these multinationals. That's part of the problem. They have to start selling. What are you going to do? No hospitals or sell mining rights by the river? And so you grant the river rights, but then you have to, all that does is it gives you the right to argue for it in court. It's not like we stop doing these things. You open up a legal strategy, and the strategy has then to be fought. And that's what's happening in Ecuador. And I learned from the new McFarland text, is A River Alive. He writes about the Ecuadorian rivers and the cloud forest on the Amazonian side of the Andes. Cloud forests, even more than rainforests, are the most biodiverse places in the world. You take out a few miles of cloud forests, proportionally the destruction to biodiversity is the largest in the world. They're the naked rivers. They're the most alive because they produce the most life. And the river is not just being fed by a spring or it's the Andes, not a lot of snow there. but by the clouds. The entire forest has river-like qualities. The amount of epiphytes, so all these plants that draw their water from the clouds by living rootlessly on trees. Their epiphytes are all over the place, all the way to the top of these trees because of this great river forest fog. And they've protected some of that from mining companies. And it was hard. And of course, the real problem is we need to ask ourselves deeply, why do we have all these mining companies? And why do we tolerate, given the catastrophic threats to our species and to the great earth itself, why do we even tolerate them? Why are we bullied by that money? That's another question for the Dharma. You know, to grant rights to rivers is also to say no to mining companies, um, no to devastation of landscapes for lithium production, which is a big deal in certainly Chile. These things are very, yeah, okay, we're going to try to make these batteries that make the transition to renewables easier, but lithium is not an infinite supply and it's produced at great ecological cost. So we have to get honest. I mean, a clear mind stops wanting to live in Disneyland and starts looking at the real cost of our position on that net. The least we can do is protect the rivers from us, directly from those who would assault them by building new mines, but also indirectly from the part of the world that enjoys the standard of living that comes from giving nothing rights besides ourselves.
Yes. So much, so much work to do. Before we conclude, we've been thinking, you've been exploring some of what Dōgen offers as a resource for an animist vision of the universe and of our planet. And I wonder, where else do you see animism showing up in Buddhism? Do you see it in early Buddhism?
Yes, that's I see it. You open the animist door and start looking for it. It's stunning how many different places it appears. Not as the main theme, but you know, the Buddha comes from a world in which the animist roots were not yet lost. I mean, that's part of the womb. That's part of what you could take for granted. Um, I mean, Buddhism's in in some measure of the word. I want to use this word carefully, but it's an indigenous perspective. I'm always struck by how well it tracks to a lot of the revival movements among indigenous peoples today. How much there's such a mutual recognition of not everything, but a lot. It's a very meaningful conversation. It's meaningful because the roots of this tradition is not in late capitalism. It's in a very different experience of the earth. And it's interesting how it would make no sense to say that the Buddhist tradition was ecological because there was no need to be ecological. You become ecological because you're responding to the catastrophe. You know, it's when you see what you're losing, when you see what we're unable to respond to, you see that our relationship to the earth as a species is an expression of dukkha that would have been unimaginable to an ancient culture, whose relationship to things was not so catastrophic. But at the same time, you know, wow, the staying power of this tradition is because sense of the problem and its sense of the resources, they they still look pretty powerful right now. Their capacity to, when well used, to worry about the world in which our practice takes place. That sword is still incredible. Manjushri's sword is as sharp as ever. Um, but if you begin looking at things like plants, you know, when King Menander is being counseled to become a good king, Be like the tree. It does not ask for whom it's going to share its shade. It covers anybody who comes seeking shade. The tree is not me and mine. The tree is not, and the tree is large if the conditions allow it to be large. It's a bonsai, even in the mountains, and that's all the root that it has. Or if you look at some of the oldest living things above the earth, so the bristlecone pines in the Great Basin of the United States. So that's for those who don't know the United States, that's the area if you cross the Sierras in California, and as they slope down, there's an enormous valley, huge desert valley called the Big Basin. And on the California side and on the mountain side, the other side, there are these bristlecone pines, 4, 5, 6,000 years old. They're not huge. They're not towering redwoods or towering sequoias. They're so ancient because they live within their conditions. And if we look at our civilizations, none have succeeded so far. We're batting 0.00 because we don't live within our conditions. We don't abide by, and we don't practice who we are by paying attention to all the things that we are and all the things that we have to cooperate with and that are cooperating with us. So the broader intelligence of our region, we don't pay attention to them. We take too much. We cut down the forests. We don't take care of the water. We pollute the air. And next thing you know, it collapses.
Well, I think that we probably requires a little bit more dense description, because certainly there have been some communities that did live within the conditions that they found, but their land was taken from them by people with more
Oh, 100%.
military power.
Oh, true. And by we, I use that we very, very delicately because it's also true that the perpetrators of climate crimes are the ones least likely to suffer from them. And the people who've contributed little or nothing to them are the most likely to. So the initial victims of our climate crimes are going to be the poor and the vulnerable, human and non-human. So by we mean actually a minority of our species.
Yes.
But this too all belongs to the Dharma, I think, to just be Dharma. For me in my own practice, what's very helpful is as the mind becomes clearer and the heart grows, you become more capable of becoming honest about the way of things, how hard it is, and the real cost of things, because you're more compassionate, you're less defensive, you're less self-protective. You become more able to see all the things within which we're implicated that we don't want to be implicated in, but we are nonetheless. So I wish everyone deep practice, and you have a wonderful teacher here. You have no idea how lucky you are. I think that's one of the great jewels to have a good teacher. So thank you for hearing me out, and always happy for comments.
Thank you so much. I'm going to encourage people to include comments in Spanish, and we'll translate them and send them to you later so that the conversation can keep rolling.
I want it to, and I hope that it will.
I think it will. Thank you so much, Jason.